Welcome to today's edition of this business program. In today's program, we'll focus much on the key principles in the application of the public-private partnerships. But before we get any further, here is a reminder of what PPPs is all about, as we discussed in the previous program. A public-private partnership, or PPP, is a legally enforceable contract between a client and a service provider. A client or contracting authority enters into partnership with a private sector service provider to build, expand, improve, or develop infrastructure or service. In the last program, we discussed the benefits of the PPPs to the general public and the government. We also discussed the priority areas of focus in Malawi for the PPPs. And finally, we discussed the goals of the PPPs. To begin with, let's outline some of the key principles which are critical to the successful delivery of the PPP outcomes. These principles have been identified as value for money, risk allocation, public interest and consumer rights, affordability, accountability, transparency, local content and technology transfer, stakeholder consultation, and public PPP procurement. Now, let's focus much on these key principles in detail. Value for money is a combination of service outcome to be delivered by the private sector, together with the degree of risk transfer and financial commitments for government. Achieving value for money criteria on PPP projects is paramount. As such, achieving the best value for money outcome should be the key consideration at all stages of the PPP project cycle. PPPs should give greater value for money than the best realistic public sector project designed to achieve similar service outputs. Quantitative factors are tested by comparing the outputs and costs of the PPP proposal against a neutral benchmark called Public Sector Comparator, which is adjusted against risk. Achieving value for money is a key requirement of governments at all stages for project development and procurement. Value for money is the driver for adopting the PPP approach rather than capital scarcity or balance sheet treatment. We continue the program with the explanation of the key principles in the application of PPPs. PPPC CEO speaks on why PPPs should adopt key principles in order to be successful.
Let me warn that PPPs badly handled can actually be very, very harmful. Badly executed PPPs could be far worse in terms of impact on the public than traditional procurement. PPPs need to be developed, designed, and executed properly if they are going to deliver services that we need at an acceptable level of price and quality. So in terms of important principles to observe as we implement PPPs, I would say first and foremost, you need a transparent environment. Lack of transparency breeds suspicion. If you are executing PPPs without adequate transparency, investors are suspicious. They perceive the process as just an act that perhaps is being staged. You are stage managing an act, you probably have already identified an investor. If that is the suspicion, then you are dead. Secondly, the implementation or the procurement of private sector investors needs to be done in a competitive manner. And our own law actually strongly endorses competition as a process of identifying a private sector investor. If you don't allow a competitive process to ensue, what basically happens is that you will not unlock efficiencies in the private sector. You will identify a party that will try as much as possible to ensure that the responsibilities and risks remain with the public sector while private sector still reaps economic rent or benefits on their investment. So a competitive process is of vital and critical importance. And I'm glad that our own law does not allow or accommodate unsolicited bids. Thirdly, you need to conduct thorough feasibility analysis before you engage, or at least you commence a procurement process. A feasibility study allows you to establish the needs for that infrastructure or the services. It gives you an opportunity to identify various risks. You then have an opportunity to allocate risks. Some risks are better left with the public sector. For example, political risks are better left with the public sector, although these days you can actually take an insurance like MEGA to take care of political risks. But by and large, risks related to politics, land, social issues are better handled by the public sector. Risks relating to designing, operating, construction, financing are better handled by the private sector. And so a feasibility study does give you that opportunity to soberly examine a project and come up with a matrix of risks, and then come up with an architecture of risks, allocate them to the public sector and private sector as the situation demands. Another important point is affordability. It's well and good to actually come up with an impressive infrastructure, but if the services that will come out of that facility are too high or are too expensive, then it defeats the whole point, because the essential purpose of having a PPP is delivery of services, and those services must be affordable as much as possible. Finally, it's essential and very, very critical that the delivery of infrastructure through a PPP passes what we call a value for money requirement. A value for money requirement, in a nutshell, what basically it means is that supposing the public sector had actually carried out the investment itself, would it have been better? Would they have delivered better value or not? And basically, you look at your history. If public sector was responsible for delivery of infrastructure, what was the quality like? How long did it take? Were there delays experienced? Were the risks as high as anticipated? Now, if by bringing in private sector, you actually complete projects much quicker, they result in more risks being transferred to the private sector, okay? And in the end, the rate of return on that investment is much better than what would have happened if the public sector was responsible. We call that deliver value for money. In other words, if it results in savings, I'm putting it in very, very simple terms, if it's quote unquote cheaper to have private sector do it than would have been the case had government done it, then the difference between the two values is normally referred to as value for money. I'm really putting it in the ordinary language so that everyone understands. In simple terms, is it cheaper if private sector was responsible than it is if public sector was the one doing it?
Another key principle in the application of PPP projects or services is risk allocation. An efficient risk allocation is vital in determining whether value for money can be achieved in public-private partnership projects. Risks will be allocated to whoever is best able to manage them, taking into account public interest consideration. The allocation of risks will therefore determine the chosen method of private sector involvement and allocation of responsibilities. Public interest and consumer rights. Consideration of public interest requires ensuring that procuring the project as a public-private partnership is not contrary to the public interest. Equally, after a decision has been taken to procure infrastructure and services through the PPP model, it is critical to ensure that the procurement process is structured in the best public interest. Public-private partnership projects should seek to safeguard users' interest, particularly vulnerable groups. Affordability. Affordability will need to be the cornerstone of all public-private partnership projects. PPP options must be affordable, both to government and the consumer, given that there are other priorities and commitments competing for scarce resources in the country. The rationale for PPPs in affordability is about management of scarce resources, better risk allocation, and more efficient and cost-effective way of delivery of services. This bears in mind that the PPP projects and services will be financed by the public resources. Accountability. The principle of accountability cannot be transferred to the private sector. At every stage of the PPP process, the procedures, the laws, the regulation and relevant policies will be followed and must be followed. Transparency. Transparency and openness are important requirements of all government procurement and is no less so for the PPPs. The procurement process laid down for Malawi will be and must be followed. Instructions to bidders will be clear and unambiguous to prevent manipulation or abuse of the process. The bid conditions and evaluation criteria will lead to the attainment of a value for money and efficiency and will be made available to all interested private sector parties. Local participation, content and technology transfer. PPP projects will be structured to encourage the maximum use of local content and technology transfer. As much as possible, the PPP arrangement will facilitate the promotion and linkages with local industries and the private sector in Malawi. The PPP projects will seek to promote Malawian participation in the private sector consortia. The government of Malawi, through PPPP Commission, has put in place strategies, the policy, schemes and mechanisms to promote local Malawian participation. Competition. Bids will be invited only when it is clear that there is scope for a private proponent to deliver value for money. All public-private partnership projects will be subjected to a competitive process in order to obtain market contestability and efficiency. Stakeholder consultation. Contracting authorities will also ensure that there is adequate stakeholder consultation, understanding and support in advance of entering into a PPP arrangement and will endeavor to identify relevant stakeholders through comprehensive consultation. Finally, public procurement and PPP procurement. PPP procurement activities that are within the scope of public procurement will also be undertaken and guided by the Public Procurement Act. Well, this is the end of our program today, but bear in mind that this program is implemented by the Public-Private Partnership Commission. Thanks for watching and be there next time.